All right, we're going to start on Unit 2, which talks about culture. This is a huge unit, right? It encompasses a lot of things, including language and religion. It also talks about a lot of different things you'll find in the materials that I provided you. It talks about architecture, which we'll discuss a little bit. It also talks about music and cultural food and all those kinds of things. I would spend some time reading it. I'm not going to cover all of that stuff. You guys can read that. So I'm not going to talk about some things, and I'll tell you as we go along. But make sure that you're reading the material that is, provided for you under the AP documents. All right, so let's start with, what is culture? All right, culture, as we know it, is a large group of items, right? It's shared experiences, traits, activities. It is concerns a group of people who have shared experiences, right? It's basically defined as a way of life of a particular people, right? It includes their language, their religion, their food, their music, right? No cultures are exactly alike, right? They are all very different, excuse me, and they are always changing, right? Any culture, whether it be small or large, is always changing. Excuse me. Let's start with some basic definitions, right? Material versus non-material culture. Material are those things that we build, right? The things that we make that represent our culture, right? So it can be the food that we make, right? If we're in the South, Southern culture, it's often things like fried foods, right? So those would represent our culture. It's the things that we create, art, right? It's if you are a Eastern Orthodox religion, you probably have icons in your house, right? Very elaborate and beautiful paintings of religious figures, right? It's the houses that we construct. It's the clothing that we wear, right? Anything that you can see, that you can touch, is a material culture, right? Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as the built environment, right? Things that you build, right? Non-material culture is anything else, right? Those things that you can't touch, right? It's the reasons that we do certain things, right? Why, the things that we believe. Language, of course, would be non-material culture. Religion, philosophies, superstitions, right? The laws and the governments that we set up are a part of our non-material culture. All right, we've also talked a lot about the difference between folk culture and popular culture, and in your book, it doesn't refer to it as folk culture. It refers to it as popular culture. Local culture. But most of the stuff you'll see on the AP test, all right, is folk culture, right? So kind of switch that around a little bit, right? Folk culture is the practice or particular customs of a certain people. Usually, as the slide tells you, it's a relatively small group, a very traditional community, right? In our book, we looked at the Amish, right? The Mennonites. If you're looking at maybe some of the indigenous populations of the Amazon rainforest, right? Things that are small groups. They follow customs that have been the same for a long period of time. It's what makes them unique, right? And they want to hold on to that because it makes them special, right? Again, think of the Basque region in Spain, right? That sets them apart from the people who live around them. And so that's important to them. It's the way it's always been. It's the way they want to keep it. Passed down from generation to generation, right? Set that next to popular culture, right? Popular culture is very large, right? While a folk culture would have a homogeneous population, people that are similar, pop culture is going to have a heterogeneous population. It reaches out to people of all different cultures, groups, races, religions, all kinds of different people will become part of popular culture. While folk culture does change, it changes much more slowly. Pop culture can change in a very short period of time. Pop culture is typically diffused over a wide area and usually very quickly because of the fact we have things like social media, television, phones, instant communication. Pop culture can come from one place to another very, very quickly. Pop culture can last for a long time or it can last for a very short time. What do they have in common? They both change over time. Folk culture will change, maybe not as fast as pop culture, and maybe with a little more difficulty, but it will change, right? And both are incredibly influential in the people who live in those particular cultures, right? You have in some places a lot of resistance to pop culture, right? My country doesn't want to be westernized. It doesn't want to look like the United States or Western culture. It doesn't want to speak English, right? I like the way things have been this way for a long time. Sometimes you'll see that in some of the countries of Southwest Asia or the Middle East, countries that have huge histories of phenomenal empires and did phenomenal things with astronomy and math and medicine. And they don't necessarily feel like the West has anything to offer them. So they will sometimes resist those particular aspects of culture. All right, let's look at another aspect of it that looking at the cultural landscape. Right, we know that landscape is the land. Cultural landscape is what we do to it to reflect who we are, right? To reflect parts of our culture, right? If we're looking at in the top left, right, you see those beautiful landscaped terraces, right? Those are farms, right, that are making use of the land that they have, right? Agriculture is certainly an important part of who we are, right? Being able to use our, pardon my dog barking in the back, we are using that land in a way to reflect who we are. You don't see that everywhere. It's part of the culture where they live. There's St. Peter's Square, which of course is an incredibly important part of who we are as Catholics, right? And the bottom, McDonald's in an Asian country, right? So the things that we think are important, and they can be as monumental as St. Peter's or as mundane as McDonald's, right? A lot of times, particularly if you're looking at McDonald's, right, you're going to see the blending together of cultures, right? What you will see if you read the materials called synchronism, right? Syncretism, where you have the blending together of two or more cultural influences. All right. The next parts of your book talk about things like architecture and how architecture can reflect our culture, right? And I think particularly you're going to see this in aspects of religious architecture, right? If you see a steeple with a cross on top, you're looking at a Christian church. If you see a dome and a minaret, obviously you're looking at an area that has a large Islamic population. A Jewish population would see a temple, right? So those kinds of things are important to know. There's an awful lot of stuff in there about different housing types, who has this kind and who has that kind. I don't think you're going to see something so specific on this particular AP test, given that you just have a very limited time. However, I would spend some time just reading through it. So if you have an opportunity to throw that in there, you can. Right? You're also going to see things about music and about food and culture, sports and culture. Again, I would read through it. I wouldn't spend a whole lot of time on it. All right, let's talk about another aspect of our culture, and that is language, right? There's a lot of vocabulary in here that you want to be familiar with, right? We know that there are various language families around the world. The language tree is huge. The largest subfamily in there is the Indo-European. Most people in the world speak Indo-European, or a language that comes from the Indo-European subfamily. Largest speakers in the world, of course, Mandarin Chinese. Countries have official languages, right? Languages that somebody, probably somebody in power, decided that was a big deal to make sure that that language was official. Official languages tend to be come from a particular area of the country. They have a language that is representative of the people who decided what it is, right? So in Paris, the official language is French. It's Parisian French, right? Because that's where all the power sits. All right, we have standard languages, languages that are used for official publications, right? We teach that language in the United States. Probably the northeastern version of English is what we typically speak. It doesn't account for the various different dialects. We'll talk about those in a second. But it's the language that's in our books that everybody will use. Most countries are multilingual, meaning that they have many languages that are spoken. They don't all have to be official, and they don't all have to be the standard languages, but people will have multiple languages across the countries. Monolingual means that there's only one language. Typically, you don't see very many monolingual countries. The one we've referred to in the past, of course, it's Japan, because most people there speak Japanese, right? As you move away from different areas, right, you're going to encounter different dialects. Dialect is just a variation on a language. Where I grew up in St. Louis, it's hey you guys. Down here it's hey y'all, right? Up in New York it's yous guys, right? There's all kinds of different ways that we say the same thing, but it reflects the people who live there. It reflects our history. It reflects distance or spatial separation from the original source of the language. It's why American English doesn't sound like the King's English in England, right? Another type of representation of a dialect, of course, is an isogloss, right? A boundary that shows a specific linguistic feature, right? If you guys will remember back in your book, we talked about Coke, pop, soda, and the different places around the country where they say different words. All right, remember lingua franca, right? Lingua franca is a language of trade and commerce, right? There is no official lingua franca, but we know that English is the most used lingua franca in the world. Most people don't speak English, will not speak English necessarily as their first language, but they will know enough to be able to communicate with other people, right? If I don't have a language in common with you and I want to do business, we're going to develop some kind of language that we can use as a lingua franca. Sometimes that language will develop into what's called a pidgin language. Something has a very simple construction, not a terribly diverse vocabulary, but something that a few people can use to communicate. If that develops into something more, right, it becomes a Creole language. Oh, God, I hate that thing. A Creole language that we will eventually teach to our kids and becomes the standard language. Swahili being a really good example of that. All right. Trying to think if there's anything else on this one. I'm gonna end this one here. Go tell my dog to be quiet, and then we'll continue on with religion in the next section.